Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at indigenous rights in Brazil,
Right.
and we're using this 2023 report from the Indigenous Navigator as our guide. Now, this report, it's not just some, dry legal document. It really is a deep dive into self-determination, access to justice, and the rights of indigenous communities to their land and resources.
Yeah.
It's a story of cultural clashes and political power plays. It's really about the fight for survival.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, I think. What's striking is that the report kind of highlights the progress Brazil has made in recent decades. The 1988 Constitution, for instance, was a landmark moment, and so was the adoption of ILO Convention 169,
Right.
which recognizes the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples.
So we're seeing some progress, but the report also suggests that it's kind of fragile progress, right?
Hmm.
Especially with all the political and economic pressures. I'm thinking about the Bolsonaro administration
Hmm.
and their attempts to introduce this heteroidentification criteria. Wasn't that essentially just an attempt to control who could even claim indigenous identity? Precisely. It was a way to limit the number of people who would be eligible for rights and resources, tied to that identity, of course. And it really ignited this huge debate about self-identification. The report dives into how self-identification gained traction in Brazil and became this crucial factor for recognition and even the development of specific public policies.
And that makes me think of this statistic from the 2010 census. The report mentions that while most self-declared indigenous individuals didn't speak an indigenous language, over half of those living on indigenous lands did. What do you make of that? Does that suggest that even when language fades, connection to the land keeps traditions alive?
I think you've hit on a key point. It speaks to the resilience of indigenous cultures, the deep connection to their ancestral lands, and it's not just a historical phenomenon. The 2022 census showed an 88.82% increase in self-declared indigenous individuals.
Wow, 88.82%. That's a massive jump. What are the potential consequences of such a dramatic demographic shift? Could this lead to a stronger voice for indigenous communities in Brazilian society and politics?
That's the question, isn't it? The report doesn't give us decisive answers, but it certainly raises these important questions about representation, political influence, and really the future of indigenous rights in Brazil. This increase, it could signify a resurgence of indigenous identity, a reclaiming of heritage that was perhaps suppressed or hidden for generations. But it also poses challenges. How will the government and society at large respond to this growing demographic? Will it translate into meaningful change? Or will it lead to further tensions and conflicts over resources and recognition?
Hmm. We've been talking about self-identification and political representation, but what about the legal landscape? The report points out this conflict between indigenous customary law and the Brazilian state justice system. Is that gap closing at all, or are these two systems still operating on fundamentally different principles?
It's a complex issue. The 1988 Constitution, while acknowledging indigenous social organization, doesn't explicitly address customary law, which creates this legal gray area. It's like two different worlds trying to coexist within the same legal framework.
But the report did highlight those resolutions passed by the National Council of Justice in 2019 and 2022. Those seemed like pretty positive steps towards ensuring indigenous access to justice and protecting their rights within the criminal system.
Those resolutions were significant because they acknowledge self-declaration and even recommend that judges consult with indigenous communities. It's a recognition that justice can't be served by simply imposing this one-size-fits-all legal framework. That doesn't consider the unique cultural context and legal traditions of indigenous communities.
So it's a step towards a more culturally sensitive approach to justice.
Yes, but the report also cautions that despite these legal advances, structural racism persists. It paints a pretty sobering picture of the prison system, which disproportionately affects indigenous individuals, many of whom are unaware of their rights under ILO Convention 169.
It feels like a constant struggle, doesn't it? Winning some battles in the legal arena, but then facing these deeply entrenched systemic issues that are much harder to dismantle.
It highlights the limitations of legal frameworks alone. True change requires a fundamental shift in societal attitudes, a dismantling of those deep-seated prejudices and inequalities that continue to marginalize indigenous communities.
Which brings us to perhaps the most contentious issue, land. The report reminds us that the Brazilian Constitution recognizes indigenous people as the first and natural guardians of their land, granting them ancestral rights. But how does that play out in reality? Are those rights effectively protected?
In theory, it sounds powerful, but the process of demarcating indigenous lands, as the report details, is often fraught with challenges. especially pushback from those powerful economic interests
Yeah.
who view the land as a resource to be exploited, not a heritage to be protected.
And the report doesn't shy away from illustrating those territorial conflicts. It talks about indigenous lands overlapping with states, municipalities, even conservation units. Sounds like a jurisdictional nightmare.
It's a tangled web of competing interests. On the one hand, you have indigenous communities fighting for their ancestral lands, lands that are not just a source of livelihood, but are deeply intertwined with their cultural identity and spiritual beliefs. On the other hand, you have those driven by economic motives, who see that land as ripe for development, for mining, for logging, for agriculture.
It's almost like a microcosm of the global struggle between conservation and exploitation. And it's not just about who owns the land, right? It's about who controls the resources on that land and how those resources are managed.
Absolutely. The report acknowledges that some indigenous communities have been successful in managing their territories and resources effectively, but many lack the resources and the legal framework for true self-governance. They're caught in this limbo between recognition of their rights and the actual power to exercise those rights.
So it's like they're being told, yes, you have rights to this land, but good luck actually exercising them. That's a disheartening reality.
It is, and it circles back to the fragility of progress we discussed earlier. Recognition is a vital first step, but without the power and resources to effectively manage their lands and resources, true self-determination remains elusive.
This deep dive is really painting a complex picture of the challenges facing indigenous communities in Brazil. It's a story of resilience, but also of ongoing struggle against powerful forces. It makes you wonder, what does the future hold for indigenous rights in Brazil?
That's a question we'll explore further, but what's clear from this report is that Brazil is at a crossroads. The recent establishment of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples offers a glimmer of hope, but achieving true self-determination will require continued vigilance, legal reforms that go beyond symbolic gestures, and crucially broader societal support that goes beyond lip service. It will require a recognition that the fate of indigenous communities is inextricably linked to the fate of the entire nation, to the preservation of its biodiversity, its cultural heritage, and ultimately, its very soul.
It's a lot to think about. And we'll be back after a quick break to dive into those questions. So stick around. It strikes me that when we talk about indigenous communities in Brazil, we're not talking about one monolithic group. The report touches on the sheer diversity of these communities. Hundreds of distinct cultures, each with their own unique relationship to their land and resources. How does this factor into their fight for self-determination?
It's a crucial point. There's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to self-determination. What works for one community might be completely inappropriate for another. Some communities may prioritize economic development, maybe in a way that aligns with their traditional practices, while others might be more focused on preserving their cultural heritage and resisting any form of outside influence.
So recognizing and respecting those diverse priorities is key, rather than imposing a single vision of progress. Speaking of which, the report does mention some indigenous communities that are successfully managing their own resources. Are there any particular examples that stand out to you, success stories that illustrate how this can work?
There are quite a few inspiring examples. Take the management of Brazil nut harvesting, for instance, or the production and sale of traditional crafts. These activities not only provide economic benefits, but also strengthen cultural identity and community cohesion. It's about empowerment, about taking control of their own destinies, not just waiting for handouts or directives from the outside.
It's a powerful model, but as we've discussed, not all communities have the resources or legal framework to achieve that level of self-sufficiency.
That's the harsh reality. Many indigenous communities are still grappling with poverty, lack of access to education and healthcare, and the constant threat of land invasion and environmental degradation. It's hard to talk about self-determination when you're constantly fighting for basic survival.
It's a vicious cycle, isn't it? Poverty and marginalization making it even harder to assert your rights and protect your interests.
Exactly. And that's what makes this fight for self-determination so multifaceted. It's about legal recognition, yes, but it's also about economic empowerment, social justice, and environmental protection. It's about creating conditions where indigenous communities can thrive, not just survive.
Almost like a paradigm shift is needed.
Right.
Moving away from this idea of helping indigenous communities towards genuinely recognizing their inherent rights and their capacity to make their own choices.
I couldn't agree more. It's about shifting power dynamics, not perpetuating paternalistic approaches. It's about supporting indigenous-led initiatives, not imposing external solutions.
So where do we go from here? What are the most critical issues that need to be addressed if Brazil is serious about upholding indigenous rights and achieving this vision of self-determination?
Well, the report offers some concrete recommendations. The demarcation of indigenous lands, for starters, needs to be expedited and enforced. It's a fundamental issue that can't be ignored any longer.
And as we've discussed, it's not just about drawing lines on a map. It's about ensuring communities have the resources and the legal framework to manage those lands effectively.
Precisely. There needs to be a significant investment in capacity building, supporting indigenous communities to develop their own governance structures, manage their resources sustainably, and preserve their cultural heritage.
And what about the issue of access to justice? We talked about some positive steps, but it seems like there's still a long way to go to ensure that indigenous communities have equal protection under the law.
Absolutely. Addressing structural racism within the justice system is paramount. Training judges and law enforcement officials on indigenous rights and cultural sensitivity is crucial. And of course, ensuring access to legal representation and culturally appropriate legal services is essential.
So creating a system that recognizes and respects indigenous perspectives, rather than just imposing a Western legal framework that might not be applicable or just...
That's at the heart of it. And we can't forget that achieving self-determination isn't just a legal or political process. It's about creating a society where indigenous cultures and values are respected and celebrated, not marginalized or assimilated. It's about building a future where indigenous communities can thrive.
That's a powerful vision. It makes me wonder if there are any international examples or models that Brazil could learn from. Have other countries managed to strike this balance between development and indigenous rights?
That's a great question. It's not a perfect picture anywhere, but there are some encouraging examples that offer valuable lessons for Brazil and the world. We're talking about some encouraging examples of countries that are finding ways to balance development and indigenous rights.
Yeah, you mentioned some encouraging examples of countries that are finding ways to balance development and indigenous rights. What can Brazil learn from these international models?
Well, one country that comes to mind is New Zealand. They have the Treaty of Waitangi. It was signed back in 1840, and it recognizes Maori land rights, and it's become this framework for ongoing negotiations and reconciliation.
So acknowledging past wrongs and actively working towards a more just future, it sounds like a good starting point.
It's been a long and complex process, of course, with its own share of challenges. But what's significant is the commitment to co-governance,
Right.
to finding solutions that respect Maori values and interests. They've even gone so far as to incorporate Maori language and culture into their education system and government institutions.
Wow, so it's not just about legal recognition, it's about cultural integration and respect. That's really impressive. Are there other examples that stand out?
Another example is Canada. They've established land claim agreements and self-governing indigenous territories, acknowledging that inherent right to self-determination.
Giving indigenous communities more control over their own affairs, it sounds like a step towards that paradigm shift we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And it hasn't been without its challenges, but it shows a willingness to move beyond assimilationist policies and recognize indigenous sovereignty.
These examples give me hope, but they also underline the fact that there's no quick fix. It requires long-term commitment, open dialogue, and a willingness to share power.
And it also requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about our own histories, about the legacies of colonialism that continue to shape these power dynamics.
This deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We've explored the complexities of indigenous rights in Brazil, from the fragility of progress to the power of self-identification, the challenges of navigating legal systems, the fight for land rights, and even some glimmers of hope from other parts of the world.
And we've seen how indigenous rights are intricately connected to broader issues of social justice, economic development, and environmental protection. These struggles are interconnected, and they demand holistic solutions.
What resonates with me is the resilience and determination of indigenous communities. They're not passive victims. They're active agents fighting for their rights, their cultures, and their futures.
And it's vital that we as informed citizens support those struggles, whether it's through advocacy, education, or simply listening to and amplifying indigenous voices.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with a question for you, the listener. This report focused on Brazil. But how do these themes resonate in your own corner of the world? Are indigenous rights being upheld? Are their voices being heard? It's a question worth pondering and perhaps acting upon.
Because ultimately, the fight for indigenous rights is a fight for a more just and equitable world for all of us. It's a fight for the recognition that we're all interconnected and our destinies are intertwined.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.